For 60 years, the old cabin had stood against the mountain. Then, in a single night, nature took it back. Martha and Harold Green surveyed what little remained of their home. Splintered beams, scattered memories, and the crushing weight of starting over at 80 years old. Their calloused hands, once strong enough to build this place from nothing, now trembled at the impossible task before them. 5 miles away, 12-year-old Elijah watched from his family's porch as the storm raged through the valley. While others whispered about the tragedy, Elijah was quietly gathering his father's tools. Could the hands of a child truly rebuild what decades of mountain life had forged? Could wisdom flow not from experience to youth, but the other way around? The morning light filtered through the broken rafters, casting fractured shadows across what was left of the Greens' living room. Martha knelt amidst the debris, her arthritic fingers carefully pulling a leather-bound album from beneath a fallen shelf. Miraculously, it had survived almost intact, though water damage had blurred the edges of several photographs. "Harold?" she called, her voice frail against the mountain air. "I found it." Harold carefully picked his way across the unstable floor, the walking stick he'd carved from a branch groaning under his weight. His time-weathered face brightened for a moment as he knelt beside his wife of 58 years. "Look at us," Martha whispered, pointing to a sepia-toned image of the two of them as newlyweds, standing proudly before the cabin's original frame. "We were so young then," Harold said, his thumb tracing the outline of their younger selves. "We built this," he added, more to himself than to Martha. But those were different times, different bodies. They turned the pages slowly, each photograph a milestone of their life together. Their children playing on the porch that now lay in pieces. Christmases around the stone hearth. Now a scattered pile of rocks. The last family reunion 5 years ago, before their son moved to Australia, and their daughter became too busy with her corporate career to make the trip up the mountain. "They've been calling," Martha said, as if reading his mind. "Robert wants us to come stay with him in Phoenix." Harold gritted his teeth at the thought of one of those retirement communities, surrounded by strangers playing shuffleboard. Lisa had offered to help with an apartment in Denver, near her. "An apartment?" Harold repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. Neighbors stacked above and below like firewood. Martha closed the album, clutching it to her chest. "What choice do we have, Harold? We can't stay here, and we certainly can't rebuild. Not at our age." Harold pushed himself to his feet, gazing through the shattered wall at the distant mountains. Those peaks had been his landmarks for 6 decades. The thought of concrete horizons and artificial lighting made something inside him wither. "We can stay with them until we figure things out," Martha continued, gathering a few more salvageable items into a plastic tub. "Their guest rooms are small, but it'll do for now." Harold nodded, saying nothing. His eyes fell on the cedar chest that had somehow remained untouched. Inside lay the paper trail of their lives. Birth certificates, their marriage license, military discharge papers, the deed to the land that now held only wreckage. "We should call Robert back," Martha said, her pragmatism taking over as she carefully wrapped a miraculously unbroken teacup in a dish towel. "He said there's a waiting list for that community, the one with the good medical facilities nearby." Harold's silence was answer enough. Martha sighed, understanding the weight of what they were losing. It wasn't just a house, but their independence, their identity, their purpose. "We had a good run here," she said softly. The afternoon stretched on as they saved what they could, a pitifully small collection compared to a lifetime of accumulation. Every so often, Martha would pause, overcome by a memory tied to some recovered object. The chipped serving platter from their fourth wedding anniversary, the hand-carved Christmas ornaments, the quilt her mother had made, now soiled beyond repair. As the daylight began to fade, Harold insisted on taking one last walk around the property. Martha watched from what was left of the porch as his stooped figure moved slowly along the perimeter they had once proudly defended against nature's slow encroachment. Now nature had reclaimed it all at once, without negotiation. When he returned, his eyes were red, but dry. "The Johnsons will be here at 9 in the morning," Martha reminded him. "We should finish packing what we can." Harold nodded, taking one last look at the sunset, casting a golden light over the devastation. "Never thought we'd leave this place in anything but pine boxes," he said quietly. Martha slipped her hand into his, her wedding band glinting dully against their intertwined fingers. "I know," she whispered. "I know." That night, they made a makeshift bed in the one corner still protected by partial walls and a roof. The next day would bring the indignity of becoming guests, then dependents. But for this one last night, they would sleep on their mountain, under the stars, even if the roof that had once sheltered them was now open to the vast, indifferent sky. 3 miles down the mountain, 12-year-old Elijah Murphy sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, meticulously arranging tools in a handmade wooden box. Each tool had its designated space: chisels graduated by size, hammers nested beside each other, a collection of screwdrivers organized by type and function. Some were standard, bought from the hardware store, but others bore the marks of customization: handles wrapped in leather strips, metal parts polished to a soft sheen from years of use. "Elijah, dinner's ready," his mother called from downstairs. "Coming?" he replied, carefully setting a small hand plane into its foam-lined compartment. The Murphy cabin was modest but sturdy, built by Elijah's father, James, and expanded twice as the family grew. Unlike most children in the valley who attended the consolidated school 30 miles away, Elijah was homeschooled, partly due to the treacherous winter roads and partly due to his parents' belief in a hands-on education. At the dinner table, the conversation inevitably turned to the storm's aftermath. "Pastor Williams said the relief fund has raised almost 2,000, reported Sarah, Elijah's mother, as she passed a bowl of stew. "It's nowhere near enough for a rebuild, but it might help the Greens with temporary housing." James nodded, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "I drove by the site today. It's worse than I thought. The foundation is cracked in 3 places." "Are they really moving to Arizona?" asked Emma, Elijah's 16-year-old sister. "That's the talk," James confirmed. "Their son's been trying for years to get them to move closer. I guess they don't have much choice now." Elijah ate in silence, absorbing every word. While some adults in the community saw him as just another kid, those who knew him recognized something different in his thoughtful stillness. He rarely spoke unless he had to, but when he did, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Mr. Green taught me how to find chanterelle mushrooms last fall," Elijah said finally. "He said his grandfather showed him when he was my age." Sarah exchanged a look with James. "It's sad, honey. They've been on this mountain longer than most of us have been alive." After dinner, Elijah returned to his room and pulled a sketchbook from under his mattress. Inside were detailed drawings, not of the spaceships or superheroes typical for a boy his age, but of architectural renderings, cross-sections of buildings, and joinery techniques he had observed from watching his father. James Murphy was known throughout the county for his skill as a carpenter, and Elijah had been his shadow since he could walk. The most recent pages held something new: measurements, angles, and material calculations for a cabin. Not just any cabin, but one designed specifically for the elderly, with wider doorways, fewer stairs, and strategically placed supports. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. "Still up?" his father asked, peeking through the door. Elijah quickly closed the sketchbook, but not before James caught a glimpse of the drawings. "That's some fine detail work," James said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Mind if I have a look?" Reluctantly, Elijah handed over the sketchbook. His father's eyebrows rose as he turned each page, noting the precision of the lines, the careful notations, the thoughtful adaptations. "You've been paying more attention than I realized," James said at last, a new respect in his voice. Elijah shrugged. "I heard you talking about retrofitting the Hendersons' place." James tapped the page. "Lowered countertops, reinforced walls in the bathroom for grab bars. You're thinking about the greens, aren't you?" Elijah nodded. "It doesn't have to be fancy, just solid and safe." James studied his son's face. At 12, Elijah still had the softness of childhood, but his eyes held the wisdom of an old soul. James had seen it when Elijah had rehabilitated an injured hawk the previous spring, and again when he'd figured out how to modify a neighbor's tractor after the man lost 2 fingers in an accident. "It's a fine thought, son," James said gently. "But a rebuild takes money. Materials, labor. The greens don't have the kind of insurance to cover that damage." "I know," Elijah said, taking the sketchbook back. "I was just thinking." After his father left, Elijah reopened the book and continued to work on his drawings late into the night. In the corner of his room, an old coffee can labeled Building Fund held his life savings, $21,743, earned from odd jobs, birthday money, and the sale of hand-carved fishing lures he crafted during the long winter months. It wasn't nearly enough. He knew that. But somewhere between the math and the impossibility lived the stubbornness that defined mountain folk. And in that space, Elijah Murphy was forming a plan. Dawn broke crisp and clear as Martha and Harold prepared to leave. The Johnsons' truck would arrive soon, marking the end of 60 years on their mountain plot. "Did you pack your medications?" Martha asked, methodically checking her mental list. Harold nodded distractedly, kneeling before a small metal footlocker he had pulled from beneath some fallen beams. The latch was rusted shut and fought against him. When it finally gave way, he paused before lifting the lid, as if opening a time capsule. Inside were his military effects: discharge papers, medals in tarnished cases, a folded American flag, and on top, his veteran's cap. The simple blue cap with gold embroidery had been with him to every Memorial Day service, 4th of July parade, and veterans' funeral since. Harold lifted it gently, brushing dust from the insignia. Faded stitching proclaimed, "Korean War veteran, 7th Infantry Division." "I thought this was lost," he murmured, turning it over in his hands. Martha stopped her packing. "You should wear it today. Might help the Johnsons recognize there's still some dignity left in these old bones." Harold settled it on his head, the familiar weight offering a strange comfort amidst the chaos. In the reflection of a broken window pane, he barely recognized himself. The proud soldier was now an old man, displaced by forces beyond his control. "Feels like a retreat," he said softly. Martha came to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't a surrender, Harold. It's a strategic repositioning." Her attempt at military terminology brought a faint smile to his lips. The hours passed with final decisions about the few belongings they would take and what they would leave for a possible later retrieval. The choices were agonizing. Every item held memories. A rocking chair he'd built while they were expecting their first child. Martha's mother's china, miraculously intact in its hutch. Books, waterlogged and unsalvageable. And the tools from Harold's workshop, too heavy and numerous to transport. By noon, their life had been reduced to 3 suitcases and 5 cardboard boxes. "We're here!" came Frank Johnson's voice from outside, followed by the slam of a truck door. As Martha went to greet the neighbors who had become their saviors, Harold took one last look around the ruins of what had been their bedroom. He stopped at the dresser where Martha's jewelry box sat untouched. The tiny ballerina inside was still poised in a perpetual arabesque. He slipped it into his pocket, a surprise for later. "You ready, Harold?" Frank asked, already loading the boxes. "Just a minute," Harold answered, his voice thick with emotion. He stood in the jagged frame of what was once the doorway, searing the view into his memory. The sloping meadow that led to the pine forest. The distant peak etched against the blue sky. It was the sight he had woken to for most of his life. The drive to the Johnsons was mostly silent. Through the passenger window, Harold watched the mountain recede into the distance. His hands rested in his lap, his fingers tracing the empty space where his cap should have been. "You two get settled in," Louise Johnson said, bustling as they arrived. She showed them to a small but comfortable guest room. "I've put fresh towels in the bathroom, and dinner's at 6. Alone, Marta began to unpack while Harold sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "It's just temporary," Marta reminded him, hanging dresses in the closet. "Just until we decide on Robert's offer." Harold nodded, but they both recognized the cliché for what it was. At 80 years old, starting over wasn't just difficult. It was next to impossible. That evening, after an awkward dinner of polite conversation and pitying glances, Harold stepped out onto the Johnsons' back porch. The stars looked different from this angle. The mountain was a dark shadow against the night sky. He thought of his cap left behind in the rubble, and everything it represented. Youthful strength, purpose, the overcoming of adversity. Inside, the phone rang. Marta answered, her voice drifting through the screen door. "Yes, Robert? We're fine for now." "No, I don't think so. I know there's a waiting list." "Yes, your father is fine. He's just adjusting." Harold tuned out the conversation, his eyes fixed on the distant outline of the mountain. Miles away, under a moon that silvered the destruction, a small figure moved carefully through the wreckage of the green cabin. The beam of Elijah's flashlight swept methodically across splintered floorboards and collapsed walls. He carried a tape measure, a notebook, and his father's level, pausing now and then to jot down a measurement or test the stability of a remaining joist. Near what had been the front entrance, something caught his eye, a patch of blue among the splintered wood. Kneeling, he pulled Harold's veteran cap from the debris, forgotten in the emotional rush of departure. Elijah brushed it off, studying the embroidered insignia with reverence. He carefully placed it in his backpack, a tangible link to the man whose home he now surveyed, with a resolve far beyond his years. 3 days into their stay at the Johnsons', Marta had established a routine that gave structure to their displacement. Mornings were for helping Louise with chores, tasks that let Marta feel useful rather than a burden. Afternoons were spent on the porch, making calls to insurance adjusters who offered little hope, and to Robert, whose patience with his parents' reluctance to commit to Arizona was wearing thin. Harold, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. He spent hours in Frank's workshop, building nothing, just running his hand over tools similar to the ones he'd lost. Sometimes he would disappear on long walks, returning with muddy boots and a distant look that worried Marta. "He went back there again, didn't he?" Marta asked when Frank returned from looking for Harold one evening. Frank nodded, removing his hat. Found him standing in what's left of his kitchen, just staring at nothing. "He's grieving," Louise said gently, handing Marta a cup of tea. "Men handle it differently than we do." That night, Marta woke to find Harold's side of the bed empty. She found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, brochures for retirement communities, pamphlets for assisted living facilities, and listings for small apartments in Denver. "We have options," he said, not looking up. "None of them are good." Marta sat beside him and took his hand. "We have each other," she said softly. "That's not nothing." 5 miles away, Elijah spread meticulously drawn blueprints across the Murphy family's dining table. His father, James, studied them with a professional eye, asking occasional questions about load-bearing calculations and material estimates. "You've thought this through," James said at last, looking at his son with a new respect. "But Elijah, this would require professional builders, not to mention $20,000 in materials alone." "We can use salvaged lumber from the old Collins barn," Elijah countered, "and riverstone to reinforce the foundation." "Dad, I've worked it all out," he insisted, flipping through detailed lists of materials and cost projections. "If we get help from the church group and use the relief fund money for specialty materials." Sarah Murphy watched from the doorway, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "Honey, it's a beautiful thought, but the Greens are already making plans to leave." "They don't want to go," Elijah said with a quiet certainty. "Mr. Green, especially. His place is on that mountain." James exchanged a look with his wife. "How do you know that?" "I just do," Elijah replied. He hesitated, then reached into his backpack. He placed Harold's veteran cap on top of the blueprints. "This belongs to him. I found it in the wreckage." James picked up the cap, examining the Korean War insignia. "Your grandfather fought in that war," he said quietly. "I know," Elijah nodded. "That's how I recognized it." A moment of silence settled over the room. 3 generations connected by a simple blue cap. "Even if, and it's a big if, we could get the materials donated," James began, "and even if we could get volunteer labor, we'd need the Greens' permission. And frankly, I'm not sure they'd accept that kind of charity." James studied his son's face. At 12, Elijah still had the softness of childhood, but his eyes held the wisdom of an old soul. James had seen it when Elijah had rehabilitated an injured hawk the previous spring, and again when he'd figured out how to modify a neighbor's tractor after the man lost his fingers in an accident. "It's a good thought, son," James said gently. "But rebuilding costs money. Materials, labor. The Greens don't have insurance that covers this kind of damage." "I know," Elijah said, gathering his sketchbook. "I was just thinking." After his father left, Elijah reopened the book and continued to work on his drawings long past midnight. In the corner of his room, an old coffee can labeled Building Fund held his savings, $21.43, earned from odd jobs, birthday money, and selling hand-carved fishing lures he made in the winter months. It was nowhere near enough, and he knew it. But somewhere between the math and the impossibility lived the stubbornness that defined the mountain people. And in that space, Elijah Murphy was forming a plan. She found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, brochures for retirement communities, pamphlets for assisted living facilities, and listings for small apartments in Denver. "We have options," he said without looking up. "None of them good." Marta sat beside him and took his hand. "We have each other. That's not a small thing." 3 miles away, Elijah spread meticulously drawn blueprints across the Murphy family's dining table. His father, James, studied them with a professional eye, asking occasional questions about load calculations and material estimates. "You've really thought this through," James said at last, looking at his son with a newfound respect. "But Elijah, this would take serious money, not to mention $20,000 in materials alone." "We can use reclaimed lumber from the old Collins barn," Elijah countered, "and riverstone to reinforce the foundation." "Dad, I've figured it all out," he insisted, flipping through detailed material lists and cost projections. "If we can get help from the church group and use the relief fund money for specialty materials." Sarah Murphy watched from the doorway, a mix of pride and worry on her face. "Honey, it's a beautiful idea, but the Greens are already making plans to leave." "They don't want to go," Elijah said with quiet certainty. "Mr. Green especially. He belongs on that mountain." James exchanged a look with his wife. "How do you know that?" "I just do," Elijah replied, then hesitated before reaching into his backpack. He placed Harold's veteran's cap on top of the blueprints. "This belongs to him. I found it in the rubble." James picked up the cap, examining the Korean War insignia. "Your grandfather fought in that war," he said quietly. "I know," Elijah nodded. "That's how I recognized it." A moment of silence settled over the room. 3 generations, linked by a simple blue cap. "Even if, and it's a big if, we could get the materials donated," James began. "And even if we got the volunteer labor, we'd need the Greens' permission. And frankly, I'm not sure they'd accept it." "Charity." "It's not charity," Elijah insisted. "It's community." The next morning, James made a few calls. To the pastor, to a lumber supplier he'd once worked for, to friends with construction experience. By the afternoon, what had seemed impossible began to take shape. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a possibility. "We should talk to them," Sarah suggested, "before this goes any further." The Murphy family arrived at the Johnsons' house just as Harold was returning from another solitary walk. Introductions were made on the front porch, with Elijah hanging back, suddenly shy in Harold's presence. "We had an idea we'd like to share with you," James began carefully once they were inside, over coffee and Louise's apple cake. James outlined the possibility, a community effort to rebuild using donated materials and volunteer labor. Harold's expression remained impassive, but Marta's eyes shone with cautious hope. "We can't accept such charity," Harold said stiffly. "With all due respect, sir," James replied. "When my father lost his arm in a logging accident 15 years ago, you were the first one to organize the planting and the harvest, so we wouldn't lose our crops. This is no different." An uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Elijah stepped forward and laid the architectural drawings on the coffee table. These weren't the rough sketches from his notebook, but professional plans, detailed and precise, beautiful in their practical elegance. "I drew these for you," he said, his voice finding its strength. "The bedrooms are on the main floor, so there are no stairs to climb. The doorways are wider than standard. There's extra insulation to keep heating costs down in the winter." Harold stared at the boy, then at the drawings. His hands, age-spotted but still strong, hovered over the plans as if touching something sacred. You drew this? He asked. Elijah nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the veteran's cap. Is this yours too? I found it when I was measuring the old foundation. Harold took the cap, turning it over in his hands. A muscle worked in his jaw as he fought back emotion. When did you do all that measuring? Marta asked. After you had to leave, Elijah admitted. I hope that was... Harold stood abruptly and walked to the window, the cap clenched in his fist, his back rigid. Marta exchanged a worried glance with the others. Harold, she ventured. It wouldn't be the same, he finally said, his voice rough. Nothing could be. No, sir, Elijah agreed. It would be better, because it would be built to last another 60 years. For 3 days after the meeting, Harold remained non-committal about Elijah's proposal. He asked practical questions about permits and septic systems, but gave no indication of his true feelings. Marta, however, began to hope, calling her son to put a hold on any decisions about Arizona. On the 4th morning, Harold announced he was going fishing. Marta knew it was his way of finding clarity. Harold always claimed he thought best with a line in the water. He borrowed Frank's pickup and left before dawn. Instead of heading to his usual fishing spot, Harold found himself on the rutted dirt road that led to his ruined cabin. As he rounded the final bend, he was startled to see a small figure among the wreckage, methodically sorting debris into piles. Elijah looked up at the sound of the truck, and surprise quickly gave way to determination on his young face. He straightened up, shovel in hand, as Harold approached. "What are you doing here, boy?" Harold asked, his tone harsher than he'd intended. "Clearing the site," Elijah answered simply, returning to his work. Salvaging what could be salvaged. Harold watched the boy separate usable timber from splintered pieces, placing intact bricks in one stack and salvageable fixtures in another. Despite his slight frame, Elijah worked with a surprising efficiency. "Your parents know you're here?" Elijah nodded. "My mom packed me a lunch." Harold stood awkwardly, feeling useless in the face of such simple purpose. Finally, he picked up a pair of work gloves from a nearby toolbox. "Those foundation stones are too heavy for you," he said gruffly. "I'll handle those." They worked side by side through the morning, speaking little. Harold was impressed by Elijah's methodical approach. This was no impulsive kid's project, but a carefully planned reclamation. Around noon, Elijah unwrapped the sandwiches his mother had packed, offering half to Harold. They sat on a fallen beam, looking out at the mountain view. "Why are you doing this?" Harold finally asked. "You barely know us." Elijah considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "My grandfather used to say, 'We're all just borrowing this mountain from each other,'" he said at last. "When someone needs help, you help. That's how everyone survives up here." Harold studied the boy's profile, recognizing something that transcended age, a mountain wisdom passed down through generations. "I'm 80 years old," Harold said. "Even if we rebuild, Marta and I, we might not have many years left here." "Then they should be good years," Elijah replied simply. After lunch, Harold helped Elijah clear an area where the new foundation would sit. The boy explained his thinking, how the new cabin would be positioned to maximize the morning sun for heat, how the roof pitch would prevent snow buildup, and how the porch would offer the same view, but with safer, wider steps. As the afternoon wore on, the trucks started to arrive. James Murphy and 2 men from the church, then Frank Johnson, and finally Pastor Williams. They brought tools, salvaged lumber from other projects, and offers of help. There was no fanfare. They just showed up and asked where to begin. Harold found himself directing the operation, pointing out where support beams had been, explaining the quirks of the mountainside terrain. For the first time since the storm, a sense of purpose straightened his spine. By the end of the day, the site was clear, the area for the new foundation marked with stakes and string. One corner overlapped the original foundation, an idea of Elijah's, to connect the old with the new. "This doesn't commit you to anything," James told Harold as they packed up their tools. "Just clearing the way, in case you decide to move forward." Harold nodded, staring at the newly marked ground in the fading light. He could almost see the ghost of the old cabin superimposed over Elijah's vision of the new. As the others left, Elijah remained, carefully placing a large, flat stone at the corner where the old foundation met the new outline. "What's that?" Harold asked. "The cornerstone," Elijah explained. "In the old days, they'd put a coin under it, for love." Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a Korean War commemorative coin he'd carried for decades. With a ceremonial gesture that surprised even himself, he knelt and placed it under the stone as Elijah held it steady. "There," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it's official." Elijah's smile was brief but bright in the gathering dusk. Together, they stood looking at the single stone. A humble beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. When Harold returned to the Johnsons' house that night, Marta looked at his face and knew. The decision had been made, not with words or formal declarations, but with a cornerstone and the simple act of working alongside a boy who saw not what had been lost, but what could be built. Word spread quickly through the mountain community. What began as Elijah's impossible dream became a collective mission when James Murphy posted a simple sign-up sheet on the community board outside the general store. Volunteers needed, green cabin rebuild. By the end of the week, the sheet was full of names, prompting Louise Johnson to create a proper schedule on her computer. The printout now hung in the Johnsons' kitchen, a grid of times and tasks that gave structure to the ambitious project. "I never expected this," Marta confessed, studying the names. Some were close neighbors, others distant acquaintances. A few were complete strangers from farther valleys. "Mountain folk look after their own," Louise replied, adding another name to the Saturday carpentry crew. "Always have." On that first official Saturday, Harold arrived at the site at dawn to find James already there, his truck loaded with lumber. Not the reclaimed pieces they'd planned on, but freshly milled pine. "The Henderson sawmill donated it," James explained. "Old man Henderson said he owed you for pulling his grandson out of Miller Creek during that flash flood back in '98. Harold shook his head in disbelief. That had been 27 years ago. "The mountains have a long memory," James smiled. By mid-morning, the site was buzzing with activity. Men Harold had known for decades worked alongside teenagers he barely recognized. Women arrived with coolers full of food and drink. Pastor Williams set up a canopy for shade, under which Marta organized the catering operation. Elijah moved about the site with a quiet authority, consulting his plans, answering questions, demonstrating techniques he'd learned from watching his father. Though he was the youngest person there, his vision guided every decision. Harold found himself partnered with Bill Cooper, a retired contractor who'd moved to the mountains 5 years earlier. Together, they laid out the foundation lines while discussing the merits of various insulation methods. "Smart design," Cooper commented, looking over Elijah's blueprints. "Wouldn't change a thing." By lunchtime, the foundation trenches were dug, and the forms were set for the concrete. The atmosphere was that of an old-fashioned barn raising, purposeful work punctuated by laughter, stories, and the occasional good-natured disagreement over technique. Marta presided over the food table, directing volunteers with the efficiency she had once used to manage a household of 5. Watching her, Harold saw flashes of the younger woman who had met mountain life with unshakable resolve, before arthritis had stolen her dexterity, before fatigue had become her constant companion. "Your grandson's a fine architect," Bill Cooper said to Harold, nodding toward Elijah. Harold started to correct him, then stopped. The relationship defied simple explanation. "Yes," he agreed, "he is." As the afternoon shadows grew long, the concrete was poured into the foundation forms. It was a milestone celebrated with cold beers for the adults, sodas for the teens, and a solemn cup of coffee offered to Elijah by Harold himself. "To a solid start," Harold said, raising his cup. Elijah's smile, rare and genuine, transformed his serious face. "Yes, sir." James came over as the crews began to pack up for the day. "We've got teams scheduled for every weekend," he told Harold. "And a few weeknights, too. At this pace, we could have the frame up in 2 weeks." "I want to do more than just supervise," Harold said, a note of frustration in his voice. "These hands still work, even if they're a bit slower." James looked at the older man thoughtfully. "Actually, there is one thing. Several of these young men have never built anything substantial. They're eager but inexperienced. They could use some guidance on traditional joinery, especially for these support beams." Harold straightened up, recognizing the offer for what it was. Not charity, but respect for his knowledge. "I could do some demonstrations," he suggested. "Show them how we built things before everything came prefabricated." "That would be invaluable," James agreed. When the volunteers left for the day, Harold stayed behind, watching Elijah take final measurements before sunset. The boy moved with the focused precision of someone much older, checking his work twice, making careful notes in a worn-out notebook. "You did this," Harold said once they were alone. "You started something impossible." Elijah looked up, squinting against the low sun. "Not impossible," he corrected. "Just hard. There's a difference." "Yes, sir. Impossible means you don't try. Hard means you try harder." Harold chuckled, a rusty sound he hardly recognized as his own. "When did you get so wise?" Elijah shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "My dad says I was born with an old soul." Looking at the day's progress, concrete setting in the forms, lumber stacked and ready, tools organized for the next day's work, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since the storm: anticipation. Not just for the finished cabin, but for the work of tomorrow, for the learning and the teaching, for the simple satisfaction of building. As they walked to James's truck, Harold noticed the sign-up sheet. Elijah's neat print listed names and schedules, skills and commitments, a community condensed onto a single page. "May I?" Harold asked, holding out his hand. The sheet was creased and smudged, consulted throughout the day. Some names Harold had known his whole life. Others were strangers, but together they formed something profound, a tangible promise passed from neighbor to neighbor, across the generations. The Johnsons' kitchen had become the command center for the cabin reconstruction effort. While the men hauled lumber and poured concrete, the women gathered around Martha's worn oak table to coordinate meals, childcare, and the 100 other necessities that kept the project moving. At the heart of this domestic operation was Martha, a faded recipe book open before her. Its leather binding was cracked with age, its pages stained and dog-eared from decades of use. Some recipes were in her mother's script, others in her own, creating a culinary genealogy that spanned generations. "We'll need to feed 20 people on Saturday," Louise calculated, consulting the volunteer schedule. "Plus whoever shows up unannounced." Martha nodded, flipping through the cookbook. "My grandmother's beef stew can feed an army," she said, "and it only gets better the longer it simmers." Sarah Murphy leaned forward to peer at the recipe. "Is that the one Harold always raves about? The one with the secret ingredient?" A smile touched Martha's lips. "Brewed coffee," she confided. "Just a quarter cup. It deepens the flavor." Soon, other women were sharing their own heirloom recipes, dishes that had sustained mountain families through harsh winters and joyful gatherings. Martha found herself an unexpected authority, her decades of feeding logging crews and farmhands suddenly a valuable currency. "You have to write that one down," insisted Beth Collins, the youngest of the group at 23. "Nobody makes biscuits like that anymore." Martha hesitated. Then, she carefully tore the recipe from her book and handed it to Beth. "Family recipes are meant to be lived," she said, "not just kept in books." The simple gesture opened the floodgates. Soon, recipes were being exchanged across generations, Martha's traditional methods meeting modern shortcuts, her careful measurements balancing the improvisational cooking of the younger women. On Saturday, Martha arrived at the build site early, overseeing the setup of 3 folding tables under a shade canopy. The women worked together in seamless harmony, organizing coolers of drinks, assembling sandwiches for lunch, and setting Martha's beef stew in heavy Dutch ovens over portable burners for the afternoon meal. From this vantage point, Martha could watch the construction's progress. The foundation was complete, the floor joists laid, and the subfloor down. Today, the wall framing would begin. The cabin would start to take on vertical form. Her gaze found Harold among the workers. He was surrounded by younger men, demonstrating the proper angle for a load-bearing joint. His hands, so often idle these past weeks, moved with memorized precision. The younger builders watched with genuine interest, respect evident in their attentive postures. "He's in his element," Louise observed, joining Martha at the serving table. "I haven't seen him this animated in years," Martha agreed. As morning eased toward noon, Martha noticed Elijah moving between the work crews, checking measurements against his blueprints and offering quiet suggestions. Despite the adults around him, the boy held a gentle authority born of expertise, not age. When the lunch bell rang, the workers approached the food tables in waves, piling their plates high with sandwiches and Martha's homemade potato salad. Elijah was among the last, waiting until the others were served before he came forward. "There you are," Martha said, fixing a plate for him. "You need to keep your strength up." Elijah accepted the food with a shy smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Green." "Martha," she corrected. "Anyone who rebuilds my home can use my first name." As the boy ate, Martha watched him with a maternal eye. "You're too thin," she concluded, "and far too serious for 12. Elijah ducked his head, uncomfortable with the attention. "Can you cook?" Martha asked abruptly. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "My mom says I'm a disaster with anything but campfire hot dogs." Martha gave a decisive nod. "Then that's what I'll teach you. Every man ought to know how to feed himself properly." She tapped her recipe book. "We'll start with something simple. Biscuits, maybe." Surprise flickered across Elijah's face, followed by a cautious interest. "I'd like that." The afternoon brought the rhythmic sound of hammers as the wall frames took shape. Martha served her famous stew to grateful workers, accepting compliments with the grace of a woman who had fed others her entire life. Near the end of the day, she found Elijah alone, studying a newly erected wall frame with intense concentration. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Just checking the angle against the winter winds," he explained. "Your old cabin took a beating from the northwesters." Martha was struck by his foresight, his awareness of the mountain's moods. "You notice things other people don't," she observed. Elijah shrugged. "My dad says I was born with eyes that see what can be, not just what is." Martha thought of her recipe book, a well of knowledge passed from mother to daughter. "Wednesday," she said suddenly. "Come by the Johnsons after school. First cooking lesson." As the workers packed up their tools and secured the site against the evening winds, Martha watched Harold walk the perimeter of what would become their new home. His steps were lighter, his posture more erect. The project was healing something in him that no medicine could reach. Later that night, as Martha added the day's food expenses to her dwindling ledger, she felt Harold's hands on her shoulders. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For feeding them. For making this feel less like charity and more like a community." Martha covered his hand with her own. "That boy," she said softly. "He's special." Harold nodded. "He sees the cabin that isn't there yet. Just like you saw a home on this mountain 60 years ago, when all I could see was wilderness." The cabin's frame now stood against the mountain sky, its timber bones defining rooms that existed only in imagination and on the blueprint. 3 weeks into the build, the volunteer crew had fallen into a rhythm. Weekends saw the site bustling with a dozen or more workers, while weekday evenings brought smaller, more specialized teams. Harold arrived early one Tuesday evening, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with metal. He found Elijah alone on the site, rechecking the alignment of the wall studs with a level and a plumb line. "Evening," Harold said, setting the bag down. "Figured I'd find you here." Elijah looked up, offering a brief smile. "Just making sure everything's true before the roof joists arrive tomorrow." Harold nodded, appreciating the boy's diligence. "Brought you something," he said, opening the bag to reveal a collection of tarnished door hinges, brass knobs, and iron latches salvaged from the old site. Elijah examined the hardware with interest. "Are these from the original cabin?" he asked. "Some of them," Harold confirmed. "Others I collected over the years, replacing ones that wore out. It's good metal. They don't make it like this anymore." Elijah turned a hinge over in his hands. "We can clean them up, reuse them." "That was my thought," Harold agreed. "But I wasn't sure they'd fit your modern design." "They have to be used," Elijah said with conviction. "It's your home. They belong here." Something in the boy's tone made Harold look at him more closely. For all his youth, Elijah possessed an innate understanding of what objects meant beyond their practical function, how they carried history and memory. As the evening deepened, more volunteers arrived. Bill Cooper brought a load of reclaimed lumber for interior trim. Pastor Williams delivered windows donated from a church renovation project. James Murphy arrived with the lumber supplier to discuss the upcoming delivery of roofing timbers. "We've got a decision to make," James explained, unrolling Elijah's plans on a makeshift table. "Standard trusses would be faster and cheaper, but they'd limit the ceiling height. Custom beams will give us that vaulted ceiling in the main room, but they'll add a couple thousand to the cost." Harold frowned. The budget is already tight. The original cabin had standard 8-foot ceilings. Bill Cooper pointed out. Worked fine for 60 years. But the new design calls for vaulted ceilings, Elijah interjected quietly, for better air circulation in the summer and more efficient heating in the winter. Harold could sense the boy's disappointment. This was an important detail of his vision. What if we milled the beams ourselves? James suggested. Old-fashioned way, like they would have originally. More labor, but it wouldn't add to the material costs. Haven't hand-cut a roof beam in 30 years, Harold mused. I've never done it, James admitted. I know the theory, Elijah offered. I've studied the techniques in my grandfather's carpentry books. The men exchanged glances. Theory was one thing, practice another. The roof was too critical a component to experiment on. I can show you, Harold said suddenly. We used to frame roofs that way before prefab trusses became standard. It takes longer, but it gives a roof character and strength, if it's done right. The decision was made. Harold would lead a team to handcraft the roof, with Elijah as his apprentice. Later that night, after the other volunteers had left, Harold and Elijah sat on a stack of lumber, examining the salvaged door hardware. Elijah had brought a container of vinegar and salt, and they worked side by side, cleaning decades of tarnish from the metal pieces. My grandpa had these, Elijah said, polishing a brass hinge to a soft glow. From the old country. Where was he from? Harold asked. Norway. He built boats before he came to America. Harold nodded, unsurprised. The boy's methodical approach, his craftsmanship, his respect for the materials, these were traits passed down through generations of artisans. You always wanted to build things? Harold asked. Elijah considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. I like to make something useful, he said finally. Something that lasts. When the last hinge was cleaned and set out to dry, Harold gathered the pieces into a wooden box he had built specifically to hold them. We'll use every one, he promised. The old joining the new. Elijah looked pleased. That's how it should be. As they walked back to their respective trucks, Harold noticed Elijah pause to study the framed doorway that would eventually become the cabin's entrance. Problem? Harold asked. Just thinking, Elijah replied. These hinges are heavier than modern ones. We'll need to reinforce the frame to hold them. We're going to have to reinforce that door jamb differently. Harold chuckled softly. Nothing gets past you, does it? My dad says I overthink things. It's not overthinking, Harold corrected. It's being meticulous. There's a difference. As Harold drove back to the Johnsons with the box of hinges secured on the seat beside him, he reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. A month ago, he had been resigned to leaving the mountain, his lifetime of skills and knowledge made irrelevant by age and disaster. Now, each evening brought a new purpose, passing on techniques to younger builders, seeing his experience valued, watching old-world craftsmanship marry modern methods. The cabin, rising from the ruins, would indeed be different from the one he and Martha had built so many years ago. Better, perhaps, not in spite of the merging of past and present, but because of it. Principal Donovan's office had the sterile efficiency common to educational administrators, with motivational posters providing the only splash of color on beige walls and framed certificates of merit hung with mathematical precision. The woman herself matched her surroundings, her gray pantsuit and tightly pinned hair, suggesting an order that did not suffer deviation. Mrs. Murphy, she began, placing a folder on the desk between them. Thank you for coming in today. Sarah Murphy nodded, her hands clasped in her lap. Your message sounded urgent. It is. Principal Donovan opened the folder, revealing a stack of absence notes written in Sarah's own elegant script. Elijah missed 11 days of school last month. Add that to his tardies and early dismissals, and he is approaching the threshold for truancy. Sarah sat up straighter. All of those absences were excused. I wrote the notes myself. Yes, the principal acknowledged. For family projects and community service. Mrs. Murphy, while I admire the values you're instilling, his formal education must take priority. Elijah's education is not suffering, Sarah countered. His grades remain excellent. For now, Principal Donovan conceded. But the patterns established now will affect his future opportunities. College admissions boards look very closely at attendance records. Sarah struggled to maintain her composure. As a mother who had homeschooled until last year, she had always believed that learning happened everywhere, not just within classroom walls. Enrolling Elijah in public school had been a difficult decision, made primarily for his social development. The cabin project is educational, she insisted. Elijah is applying mathematics, physics, architectural principles. Mrs. Murphy, the principal cut in. I don't question the value of hands-on experience, but there is a reason we have standardized curricula and attendance requirements. The meeting ended with a warning. Any further unexcused absences would trigger a formal intervention. Sarah left feeling defensive and uncertain, clutching the folder of absence slips as if it were evidence in a trial. That evening, as James and Emma ate dinner, Sarah relayed what had happened at the meeting. Elijah's place at the table remained empty. He was at the build site with Harold, working on the roof trusses. Maybe she has a point, James admitted reluctantly. Elijah has spent every spare minute on that site. Weekends, too. You were the one who encouraged him, Sarah reminded her husband. I didn't expect it to consume him, James countered, or to affect his schooling. The discussion continued until headlights swept across the front window, signaling Elijah's return. He came in quietly, his clothes dusty, his expression weary but satisfied. There he is, James said, motioning to the plate they had kept warm. The master builder. Elijah gave a brief smile, washing his hands before joining them. How's the roof coming? Emma asked. Good. Mr. Green showed me how to cut birds' mouth joints for the rafters. They'll last 100 years, he says. James and Sarah exchanged a look. Son, James began carefully, we got a call from your principal today. Elijah's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. You've missed a lot of school, Sarah continued. They're concerned. I haven't fallen behind, Elijah protested. I've done all my assignments. It's not just about the assignments, James explained. It's about being there, participating in class. Elijah put his fork down. The cabin has to be ready before winter. We have less than 2 months until the first heavy snow. Your education comes first, James insisted. Isn't this education? Elijah retorted, his voice rising, which was rare for him. Mr. Green is teaching me things I could never learn in a textbook. Real skills. But there are rules, Elijah, Sarah began. They're going to lose everything if we don't finish, he cut in, emotion cracking his usual composure. Everything they built their entire lives. The raw concern in his voice silenced his parents. This wasn't just about building a structure. It was about saving something Elijah saw as irreplaceable. Before the argument could resume, a knock sounded at the front door. James opened it to find Harold on the porch, hat in hand. Sorry to interrupt your dinner, the older man said. I left some tools in Elijah's pack. Need them for the job tomorrow. Sensing the tension, Harold hesitated in the doorway. Everything all right? James sighed. The school is concerned about Elijah's absences. The project is affecting his attendance. Ah. Harold nodded, understanding at once. That's partly why I'm here, actually, to talk about a compromise. Invited inside, Harold laid out his proposal. Elijah would attend school full-time, maintaining perfect attendance. In return, Harold would come to the school twice a week during Elijah's study hall. They would continue their work together, not on the physical cabin, but on the technical aspects of the build. They would turn the project into an independent study, with Harold acting as a community mentor. I spoke with the principal this afternoon, Harold explained. She seemed receptive, as long as there's proper documentation and educational objectives. The Murphys were stunned. This methodical planning was unexpected from a man they had initially seen as resistant to change. You did this for Elijah? Sarah asked. Harold looked at the boy, a hint of affection softening his weathered features. He's done a lot for me. Seems only fair to return the favor. Later, after Harold had left with his tools, James found Elijah at the kitchen table, homework spread out before him. That was pretty incredible, James remarked. Harold going to bat for you like that. Elijah nodded, a small smile on his lips. He gets why it's important. James watched his son thoughtfully. You've made quite an impression on him. He's taught me a lot, Elijah said simply. I think it's been mutual, James observed, then pointed to the small stack of absence notes that had made their way home from the principal's office. Elijah picked one up, studying Harold's careful script explaining the educational value of traditional framing techniques. The formal language and respectful tone revealed a side of Harold few in the community ever saw. The learned man behind the gruff exterior, the teacher within the builder. The blueprint fluttered in the strengthening wind, its edges curling despite the rocks weighting down its corners. Elijah lunged to catch it, as a particularly strong gust threatened to rip it from the makeshift table. Weather's turning, James observed, scanning the western sky, which was darkening earlier than usual for the time of year. October had arrived with an unexpected fierceness, dusting the highest peaks around the valley with the first layer of snow. What had seemed like a comfortable deadline now felt precarious. As the volunteers gathered for the weekend work session, Harold studied the well-worn blueprint. Its once crisp lines were now smudged from handling, the corners soft from constant folding. Over the past few weeks, the document had evolved. Annotations were added in different hands. Modifications were marked in colored pencil. Coffee rings created impromptu topographical features on the paper landscape. We need to prioritize, Harold announced to the assembled crew. Roof and exterior walls before anything else. Bill Cooper frowned at the plan. That's still 2, maybe 3 weekends of work. The forecast is calling for snow by next Thursday. A murmur of concern rippled through the group. Snow in the high country didn't arrive politely. It descended with authority, making construction work dangerous, if not impossible. We can do it in 1, Elijah stated quietly. All eyes turned to the boy. If we have more help, he continued, pointing to specific areas on the blueprint. Focus the crews on critical paths. Work longer hours. James shook his head. Most people here have other commitments, son. Jobs, families. The church has its harvest festival next weekend, Pastor Williams added. A lot of our regular volunteers will be there. Harold watched Elijah's face, seeing disappointment war with determination, the weight of responsibility clear in his furrowed brow. The boy had poured everything into this project, calculating every step with a precision men twice his age might envy. Now, nature itself seemed to be working against his carefully laid plans. "What if we change the approach?" Harold suggested, running a gnarled finger across the blueprint. "We get the structure dried in, even if it isn't pretty. Something to keep the snow out while we finish the interior work over the winter." Elijah considered this, his mind visibly recalculating. "We'd have to resequence, prioritize the weatherproofing over the finish work." The group huddled close as Elijah began marking up the blueprint with new annotations, simplified roofing techniques, temporary solutions, and contingency plans. The elegant design he had originally envisioned was being compromised by practical necessity, yet he adapted with remarkable flexibility. By mid-afternoon, the revised plan was in motion. Volunteers were redeployed to critical tasks. Supplies were reorganized to prioritize weatherproofing materials. The pristine blueprint that had guided them for weeks was now a battlefield document, marked with hurried revisions, smudges, and the fingerprints of men checking their measurements. As daylight faded, unusually early due to the approaching storm front, Harold found Elijah alone on what would eventually be the front porch. The boy was sitting with the battered blueprint spread across his knees, making additional calculations by the light of a headlamp. "You should head home," Harold told him. "It's getting cold." Elijah nodded without looking up. "Just finishing these adjustments for tomorrow's crew." Harold sat down on the rough plank beside him, his joints protesting the movement. "Plans change," he said after a moment. "Nature makes sure of that." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But I promised him he'd be home before the first snow." "Home is a relative thing," Harold said thoughtfully. "Right now, it's the Johnsons' spare room. Before that, it was a cabin that took 30 years to feel like home. After Martha and I got married, we lived in a tent on this very spot for 2 months while I built the first room." Elijah looked up, surprised. "A tent?" "Canvas walls and a dirt floor," Harold confirmed. "Martha hung curtains inside it, if you can believe that. Said it made it feel more permanent." The boy's expression softened slightly. "So you weren't worried about the snow?" "Oh, we were terrified," Harold chuckled. "First blizzard almost sent us running back to her parents' place. But we stayed. Got the one room finished just before the heavy snows came." A comfortable silence settled between them, the wind whistling through the half-finished walls. "The blueprint wasn't perfect either," Harold continued, tapping the paper on Elijah's knee. "Had to change things as I went. Lack of materials, mistakes in my math, suggestions from Martha." A fond humor touched the last word. Elijah studied the time-worn document before him. The smudges and revisions now looked less like flaws and more like a record of adaptation. "It's still a good plan," Harold assured him. "Just an evolving one." A single snowflake fell, then another, landing on the blueprint without being swept away. Elijah watched as they melted into the paper, adding one more mark to the document's story. "We should get this inside before it's ruined," he said, carefully folding the damp plan. "Too late for that," Harold observed with a wry smile. "But that doesn't make it any less valuable." As they walked toward their trucks, the snow began to fall more heavily. Not yet the deep blanket that would eventually cover the mountain, but a clear warning of what was coming. Harold looked back at the half-finished cabin, its frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. "It'll stand," Elijah said, following his gaze. "Maybe not exactly as planned, but it will stand." Harold nodded, recognizing in the boy's words an understanding that reached far beyond blueprints and building materials, an acceptance that some of life's most enduring structures are those shaped by adaptation, not by a rigid adherence to original plans. The cabin roof was nearly finished, its dark green metal panels reflecting the pale November sun. Despite an early snow, the volunteer crew had managed to enclose the structure, creating a weatherproof shell that would allow interior work to continue through the winter. The windows were installed, the doors hung on salvaged hinges, and the propane heater Harold had procured from a retiring neighbor made the space usable even on the coldest days. From the Johnsons' kitchen window, Marta watched Harold climb into Frank's truck for the day's work at the site. Something in his movements caught her eye. A stiffness that went beyond the usual morning aches, a fleeting grimace as he settled into the passenger seat. "He's pushing himself too hard," she murmured. Louise joined her at the window. "Men his age should be playing checkers down at the general store, not framing houses." "You try telling him that," Marta sighed. The two women spent the morning preparing meals for the weekend volunteers, but Marta's mind kept drifting back to Harold. At 60, they had discussed slowing down. At 70, they made token concessions to age, a handrail here, a step stool there. By 80, they had settled into a rhythm of careful management, acknowledging limitations while fiercely guarding their independence. Now Harold was moving as if he had turned back the clock, taking on physical tasks that men 20 years his junior approached with caution. Shortly after noon, the kitchen phone rang. Louise answered, her expression shifting to one of concern as she listened. "It's Frank," she said, covering the receiver. "Harold's having chest pains." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of frantic activity. The mountain community had no hospital, only a small clinic staffed by a physician's assistant 3 days a week. Frank drove Harold straight there, where the PA administered nitroglycerin and arranged for transport to the regional hospital, 60 miles down the mountain. By evening, Marta was sitting by Harold's hospital bed, watching the monitors track his heartbeat in steady green pulses. It was a warning shot, the doctor had assured them after tests ruled out a major heart attack, but one that must be taken seriously. Now Harold fidgeted with the hospital band on his wrist, frustrated by the confinement. "An unnecessary fuss," he grumbled. "Probably just indigestion." "Indigestion doesn't show stress patterns on an EKG," Marta countered, her tone sharper than she intended. Beneath the sharpness was fear, the same fear she had carried for 60 years of loving this stubborn, unyielding man. "They're releasing me tomorrow, Marta. I'll be back on site by the afternoon." "You most certainly will not," Marta stated firmly. "The doctor said 2 weeks of rest." 2 weeks? Harold's face fell. "The interior framing is scheduled. Elijah is counting on me to help with the stonework for the fireplace." "Elijah would rather have you alive than have a perfect fireplace," Marta said softly, taking his hand. Harold fell silent, staring at the ceiling tiles. They both knew the truth behind his frustration. It wasn't just about the project. It was the fear of being sidelined, of becoming irrelevant. When Marta returned to the Johnsons the next day to pack a bag, she found Elijah sitting on the front porch steps, Harold's old wooden toolbox beside him. "Mom told me about Mr. Green," he said, standing up quickly. "Is he?" Marta managed a small nod, touched by the genuine concern on the boy's face. "The doctor called it a warning, but he needs to rest." "The crew wanted me to bring this for him," Elijah explained, gesturing to the toolbox, "for when he's feeling up to it." Marta recognized the box. Harold had made it decades ago, each compartment sized for a specific tool, the lid inlaid with contrasting woods that formed their initials. She'd thought it was lost in the storm. "We found it under some of the debris last week," Elijah continued. "I restored it, replaced the hinges, refinished the wood." Marta ran her fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the care in the restoration. "He'll be thrilled," she said, "but I'm afraid he's on strict orders not to use any tools for a while." "It's not for using," Elijah explained. "It's for planning." He lifted the lid to reveal not Harold's usual carpentry tools, but drafting instruments, pencils, a small T-square, templates, and a compass. "I thought he could work on the designs," Elijah said. "The interior details, the built-ins for the bedroom, the reading nook you mentioned you wanted." Marta blinked back a sudden rush of tears. This boy, all of 12 years old, understood what Harold needed more than any doctor. Not just rest, but purpose. The following weekend, Harold sat propped up in his hospital bed, the restored toolbox open on his lap. On the bedside table lay sketches of cabinetry, detailed drawings of molding profiles, and notes on the placement of electrical outlets and light fixtures. Elijah sat in the visitor's chair, his notebook open, listening intently as Harold explained the mathematics behind a perfect arch. "The curve has to be just right," Harold insisted. "Too shallow, and it looks weak. Too steep, and it overpowers the space." Elijah nodded, taking careful notes. "I'll show the framing crew tomorrow. Make sure they understand the ratio." When the boy left, promising to return with progress photos, Marta saw the change in her husband. He was still physically frail, but his mind was energized, his lifetime of experience finding new expression through Elijah's willing hands. That night, while Harold slept, Marta opened the toolbox again. Tucked inside, amongst the drafting tools, she found a small note written in Elijah's precise hand. "A good builder knows when to let others carry the load," it read. "A great builder knows how to guide them as they do." She smiled, recognizing the words as Harold's own wisdom, shared once and now returned to sustain him when he needed it most. December blanketed the mountain in heavy snow, quieting the world beneath a white mantle. Inside the cabin, work continued at a steady pace. Insulation was installed, drywall was hung and taped, and electrical wiring was snaked through the walls. Though the exterior work had paused until spring, the enclosed structure provided a warm haven for the finishing touches that would transform a building into a home. Harold, now recovered enough for regular, if closely supervised, visits to the site, stood in what would be their living room, overseeing the installation of the stone fireplace. Built from river rocks gathered from the creek bordering their property, it was a twin to the one in the original cabin, but with subtle improvements: a more efficient flue, a wider mantel, and a stone hearth bench that would absorb and radiate heat. "Perfect," Harold nodded to Bill Cooper, who had taken over as lead mason. "Marta will appreciate that sitting area on a cold morning," Bill commented, admiring their handiwork. "The boy thinks of everything." Harold smiled with something akin to fatherly pride. In the weeks since his health scare, Elijah had stepped into a leadership role that defied his age, coordinating volunteers, troubleshooting problems, and ensuring Harold's vision merged seamlessly with his own innovations. The afternoon brought a special delivery: the cabin's front door, a solid oak piece that James Murphy had been crafting in his workshop for weeks. As volunteers helped carry it from the truck, Harold noticed Elijah hanging back, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his posture. "Something wrong?" Harold asked, as the door was temporarily set in its frame. I made something, Elijah said, reaching into his backpack. For the cabin. For you and Mrs. Green. He pulled out a wooden plaque, about 15 inches long and 10 inches high. Carved into its surface was the silhouette of the mountain range visible from their front porch, detailed with remarkable precision. Beneath it, in carefully executed letters, it read, Green Mountain Haven. Harold took the plaque, running his fingers over the smooth wood and crisp carving. You did this? Elijah nodded. My dad helped with some of the lettering, but the design and the carving were me. It's beautiful, Harold said, genuinely moved. But I'm not sure about the name. Elijah's face fell. You don't like it? It's not that, Harold assured him. It's just, a house's name should reflect its history, don't you think? And the history of this cabin includes more than just Marta and me. Understanding dawned on Elijah's face. You want to change it? Harold nodded thoughtfully. What about Green Murphy Haven? It seems fitting considering how much of yourself you've poured into these walls. Elijah stared at him, clearly stunned by the suggestion. You'd put our name on your house? Why not? Your mark is everywhere on this place, your design, your vision. Harold gestured around them. Besides, a name ought to tell the truth, and the truth is, this place wouldn't exist without you. James Murphy, who had overheard the exchange while adjusting the door hinges, paused his work. That's a high honor, Harold. A well-earned one, Harold replied firmly. The moment was interrupted by Marta's arrival with a group of women, carrying containers of hot food for the workers. She spotted the sign in Harold's hands and came over to examine it. What's this? She asked. The sign for our cabin, Harold explained, though we're discussing a small amendment to the name. Marta studied the beautifully carved piece. Green Mountain Haven, she read. It's lovely, Elijah. Harold wants to change it to Green Murphy Haven, James explained, watching his son's face carefully. Marta looked from Harold to Elijah, understanding the significance at once. I think that's perfect, she said softly. This house belongs to both our stories now. Elijah's usual composure faltered slightly, his eyes shining with emotion. He blinked it away quickly. I can make a new one, he offered. No need to start over, Harold said. Just add to what you've already created. Like we did with the cabin. Later, as the winter sun set early behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow, the volunteers gathered for a small ceremony. The front door was officially set on its hinges, the temporary construction entrance replaced by the permanent one. Harold insisted that Elijah be the one to mount the modified plaque. Green Murphy Haven, now carved beneath the mountain silhouette. The addition was so skillfully integrated, it looked as though it had been part of the original design. Every home needs a proper name, Harold announced to the assembled group. Something that tells its story and welcomes those who enter. Pastor William stepped forward with a small bottle of oil. In the old tradition, he explained, we bless the doorway through which all the life of the house will pass. A quiet reverence fell over the gathering as the pastor anointed the doorframe, his prayer acknowledging not just the physical structure, but the community that had raised it. A modern-day barn raising, born of need and love. As night fell and the volunteers departed, Harold, Marta, and Elijah remained behind, standing in the doorway beneath the newly installed plaque. No words were needed to share the moment, each of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. A home destroyed, a dream thought impossible, and the bridge between generations that had made its restoration possible. Out of disaster had come not just rebuilding, but renewal. a home whose very name now told the story of what can happen when determination transcends age, when wisdom flows between the old and the young, and when a community remembers that its strength lies in caring for its own. As the deep cold of January settled over the mountain, work inside the cabin continued at a steady pace. The walls were painted the soft, warm yellow Marta had chosen. Hardwood floors were laid using a combination of salvaged planks from the original structure and new oak, and the kitchen cabinets were assembled to Harold's exacting specifications. The Johnsons had graciously extended their hospitality through the winter, but both Marta and Harold were growing anxious to return to their own space, their own routines, their own privacy. Though never spoken aloud, the weight of dependency rested heavily on them both. The plumbing inspector signed off yesterday, James reported during one of their regular progress meetings, held around the Johnsons' kitchen table. Final electrical is scheduled for next Tuesday. And the timeline for moving in? Harold asked, trying to keep the impatience from his voice. James exchanged a look with Elijah before answering. Officially, we're still looking at the beginning of February. There are a few finishing touches. We don't need finishing touches, Harold interjected. Just a functional bathroom and kitchen. The rest can wait. Marta placed a hand gently on her husband's arm. We've already waited so long, she reminded him. A few more weeks won't hurt. But later that night, as Marta prepared for bed in the Johnsons' guest room, she found Harold sitting on the edge of the mattress, staring at a pill bottle with an expression of profound frustration. 3 pills a day, he murmured. Morning, noon, and night, for the rest of my life. Marta sat beside him, the mattress dipping slightly under their combined weight. It's a small price to pay to have you around, she said lightly. Harold's expression didn't change. I'm not the man I was, Marta. I can't build like I used to. I can't even carry my own furniture without risking another heart problem. None of us are who we used to be, she replied pragmatically. That's what life does to a person. The following Saturday, an unexpected snowstorm forced the cancellation of the scheduled workday. By Sunday afternoon, however, the mountain roads were clear enough for essential travel. Harold convinced Frank to drive him up to the cabin site, claiming he needed to check that no pipes had frozen during the temperature drop. When they arrived at the cabin, Harold was surprised to see Elijah's father's pickup truck already parked outside. Looks like someone beat us to it, Frank commented. Inside, they found Elijah working alone, installing what looked like handrails along the short hallway leading to the bedroom. What's this? Harold asked, running his hand over the smooth wooden rail. Elijah looked up, momentarily startled by their arrival. Oh, it's just something I thought might be useful, he said, returning to his work with focused precision. Harold watched as the boy secured the mounting brackets with practiced movements. The handrails were beautifully crafted from cherry wood, their design consistent with the cabin's overall aesthetic. They were functional elements disguised as decorative details. Looking around, Harold began to notice other subtle features he hadn't seen before. A slight ramp instead of a step at the back entrance. Electrical outlets positioned higher than standard to reduce the need for bending. Lever-style door handles instead of traditional knobs. A retractable stool hidden inside a closet for support. These modifications, Harold said slowly, they weren't in the original plans. Elijah focused on aligning the final bracket. I added them as we went along. But, Harold realized, these are all little changes for us. He met the boy's eyes. Because we're old. The boy finally looked up, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. For safety, he corrected, and convenience. Harold felt a complex wave of emotions, gratitude mixed with pride, combined with the bitter acknowledgement of his own limitations. Smart design, he said finally, echoing Bill Cooper's earlier assessment of Elijah's work. I didn't want it to be obvious, Elijah explained, relaxing slightly at Harold's apparent acceptance. My grandfather, he hated anything that made him feel old. But after your heart scare, I thought. He trailed off, suddenly unsure. Harold nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. You thought we might need help, but wouldn't want to ask for it. Yes, sir. Frank, who had been examining the modifications in the kitchen with interest, joined them. The kid thinks of everything, he commented. These pull-out shelves in the lower cabinets are brilliant. Louise would love these in our kitchen. As they continued to visit the cabin, Harold discovered more of Elijah's thoughtful innovations. A walk-in shower with both fixed and handheld shower heads. A kitchen island at the perfect height for Marta's 5'6" frame. Extra lighting in areas where tasks required precision. None of these changes called attention to themselves as adaptations for age or disability. I packed up most of our things today, Marta said later. It wasn't much in the end. We travel lighter now, Harold observed. What went unsaid between them was the awareness that this house would likely be their last. A place built not just for their current needs, but with foresight for the challenges that inevitably come with aging. And Elijah's careful adaptations acknowledged that reality while preserving their dignity and independence. As they prepared for sleep in what would soon cease to be their temporary shelter, Marta found herself unexpectedly in tears. The Johnsons have been so good to us, she explained when Harold noticed. Everyone has. We'll pay it back, Harold assured her. Maybe in different ways, but we'll pay it back. Marta nodded, understanding that gratitude, like the community quilt, took many forms, sometimes visible and tangible, other times woven into the invisible fabric of daily life. February dawned with an unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself approved of the timing. Snow lingered in the shaded hollows, but the path to the newly completed cabin was clear and dry beneath a brilliant blue sky. The vehicles began arriving mid-morning, trucks and SUVs navigating the mountain roads with practiced ease, parking along the widened driveway James Murphy had insisted on creating for visitors. Children tumbled out of back seats clutching carefully wrapped packages. Adults carried covered dishes and folding chairs. Inside the empty cabin, Elijah made the final adjustments, checking that every window opened smoothly. Every door was perfectly level. The stone fireplace drew correctly. Though professionals had handled the plumbing and electrical, nearly every other aspect of the construction bore his influence. From the precise angle of the roof designed for heavy snow loads, to the custom bookshelves built to accommodate Harold's specific collection. The inspection had passed, the certificate of occupancy issued. All that remained was the handover, the moment a construction site would officially become a home. In his pocket, Elijah carried a special creation he'd been working on for weeks. Using traditional blacksmithing techniques learned from videos and books, he had forged an iron key unlike any modern equivalent. It was substantial and ornate, more symbolic than practical in an age of standardized locks. The handle incorporated design elements from both the original cabin and the new structure, while the shaft and teeth were precisely cut to operate the front door lock. As noon approached, Pastor Williams gathered the community on the front porch, where Harold and Marta stood arm in arm. visibly moved by the turnout. "Neighbors," the pastor began, his voice carrying over the quiet assembly. "We are here today to celebrate more than just a building. We celebrate resilience, community, and the bridge between generations that has made this day possible." Harold's gaze swept across the crowd. Familiar faces, made even more so during the months of construction. Bill Cooper, who had taken time off work to perfect the stone hearth. The Henderson family, who donated lumber and provided meals. Louise and Frank Johnson, whose guest room had become a temporary haven. And standing slightly apart, the Murphy family, James and Sarah, watching proudly as their son waited with a contained anticipation, the weight of the moment clear in his serious expression. 6 months ago, Pastor Williams continued, we witnessed destruction. Today we celebrate creation, not just the creation of walls and a roof, but the creation of something less tangible, a testament to what we can accomplish when we come together. Marta squeezed Harold's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The past months had been challenging, but they had also brought unexpected gifts, new friendships, deeper connections, the discovery that independence and interdependence were not mutually exclusive concepts. "And now," the pastor announced, turning to Elijah, "I believe someone has a presentation to make." Elijah stepped forward, suddenly self-conscious before the assembled crowd. Though he had spent months directing adults twice and 3 times his age, public speaking was still a challenge for the quiet, thoughtful boy. "Mr. and Mrs. Green," he began, his voice steadying as he focused on the elderly couple. "When we started this project, you trusted me with your home. Today, I want to give that trust back to you." From his pocket, he produced the handmade key, the metal glinting in the winter sun. "This key opens the front door lock," he explained. "I made it by hand, the old-fashioned way, like the hinges from your original cabin. It's one of a kind, just like this house." Harold accepted the key, its weight considerable in his palm. Unlike the light, mass-produced keys of modern homes, this one had presence, the physical embodiment of security and belonging. "The best locks," Elijah continued, confident in the technical aspects, "have pins that align perfectly when the right key is inserted. It's about a precise match, each part serving its exact purpose." Harold nodded, understanding the metaphor. The rebuilding process had been like that, with each person contributing their specific skills. Each element served its unique function, creating something stronger than any single component. "Want to try it?" Elijah asked, gesturing to the door behind them. Harold handed the key to Marta. "You should do the honors," he said softly. "You're the one who makes any place we live a home." With hands that belied her 80 years, Marta inserted the key into the lock. The soft click of the mechanism turning prompted a spontaneous cheer from the gathered crowd. As the door swung open, Harold and Marta stood on the threshold of their new beginning. Beyond the door lay rooms filled with light. Some furniture was salvaged and restored, some donated or newly bought. All of it arranged according to Marta's specific instructions, relayed through Elijah's careful notes. "Welcome home," Elijah said simply. Marta impulsively pulled the boy into a hug, forgetting etiquette in the emotion of the moment. Harold's hand found Elijah's shoulder, a firm squeeze that conveyed what words could not. Together, they crossed the threshold, the old couple and the young boy whose vision had created not just a structure of wood and stone, but a legacy of resilience, connection, and the quiet power of seeing possibility where others saw only ruin. Spring came to the mountain, with a gentle persistence that mirrored the greens settling into their new home. Snowdrops pushed through the last of the melting drifts. Creeks swelled with runoff, and the cabin settled onto its foundations, with the soft creaks and groans that became familiar nightly sounds to its occupants. The evening ritual had become Harold's favorite part of each day. After dinner, he would settle into the handcrafted rocking chair, positioned perfectly on the covered porch. From that vantage point, he could watch the changing moods of the mountains, the shadows of clouds racing across the distant slopes, the deer emerging cautiously from the forest edges, and the occasional eagle riding the thermal currents high above the valley. Marta would often join him, bringing mugs of tea or coffee, depending on the evening chill. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Other times, they planned small additions to the garden or discussed letters from their faraway children who had been astonished and moved by the news of the community's rebuilding efforts. On this particular evening, Harold recognized the sound of an approaching vehicle, the distinctive rhythm of James Murphy's truck navigating the final curve before their driveway. Moments later, Elijah appeared, carrying his school backpack and a small toolbox. "Hey," he called, jogging up the porch steps. "I finished my weather station project. I thought you might want to see it." Since move-in day 6 weeks prior, Elijah had continued his regular visits, at first to make small adjustments to the new house, but soon evolving into a relationship that defied simple categorization. Not quite grandfather and grandson, more than mentor and student. They found common ground in shared projects and quiet conversation. "Let's have a look then," Harold replied, making room on the small porch table. Elijah carefully lifted a wooden box from his pack. Inside, a combination of digital components and traditional mechanical gauges created an elegant fusion of old and new technology. It measures temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed, Elijah explained, pointing to each element. "The anemometer needs to go on the roof, but the rest of it can be mounted right here on the porch." Harold studied the craftsmanship with genuine appreciation. "Your project?" "Mostly," Elijah admitted. "My dad helped with the weatherproofing for the outdoor sensors." Marta came out from inside, carrying a plate of oatmeal cookies still warm from the oven. "I thought I heard your voice," she said, smiling at Elijah. "Just in time for the first batch." As they ate the cookies, Harold and Elijah discussed the best placement for the meteorological instruments. James studied his son's face. At 12, Elijah still had the softness of childhood, but his eyes held the wisdom of an old soul. James had seen it when Elijah had rehabilitated an injured hawk the previous spring, and again when he'd figured out how to modify a neighbor's tractor after the man lost his fingers in an accident. "It's a good idea, son," James said gently. "But rebuilding costs money. Materials, labor. The Greens don't have insurance to cover that kind of damage." "I know," Elijah said, taking his sketchbook back. "I was just thinking." After his father left, Elijah reopened the notebook and continued working on his drawings long past midnight. In the corner of his room, an old coffee can labeled "Construction Fund" held his life savings, $21,743, earned from odd jobs, birthday money, and the sale of hand-carved fishing lures he made during the winter months. It wasn't nearly enough, and he knew it. But somewhere between the math and the impossibility lived the stubbornness that defined the mountain people. And in that space, Elijah Murphy was forming a plan. The dawn broke cool and clear as Marta and Harold prepared to leave. The Johnsons' truck would be there soon, marking the end of 60 years on their mountain homestead. "Did you pack your medications?" Marta asked, methodically checking her mental list. Harold nodded, distracted. He was kneeling before a small metal footlocker he'd pulled from beneath a fallen rafter. The latch was rusted shut. When it finally gave way, he paused before lifting the lid, as if opening a time capsule. Inside lay his military belongings, discharge papers, medals in tarnished cases, a folded American flag, and on top of it all, his veteran's cap. The simple blue hat with its gold embroidery had been with him for every Memorial Day service, 4th of July parade, and veteran's funeral since he'd come home. Harold lifted it gently, wiping dust from the insignia. Faded stitching proclaimed, Korean War veteran. Thought this was lost, he murmured, turning it over in his hands. Marta stopped her packing. You should wear it today, she said. It might help the Johnsons see there's still some dignity left in these old bones. Harold settled it on his head, its familiar weight offering a strange comfort amidst the chaos. In the reflection of a broken window pane, he barely recognized himself. The proud soldier was now an old man, displaced by forces beyond his control. Feels like a retreat, he said quietly. Marta came to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. This isn't a surrender, Harold. It's a strategic repositioning. Her attempt at military terminology brought a faint smile to his lips. The hours passed in a blur of final decisions, of choosing the few belongings they would take and what they would leave behind. The choices were agonizing. Every item held a memory. A rocking chair he'd built when they were expecting their first child, Marta's mother's china miraculously intact in the hutch, and the waterlogged books and heavy tools in his workshop, too numerous to move. By midday, their life had been reduced to 3 suitcases and 5 cardboard boxes. "We're here!" Frank Johnson's voice called from outside, followed by the slam of a truck door. While Marta went to greet the neighbors who had become their saviors, Harold took one last walk through the ruins of their bedroom. He stopped at the dresser, where Marta's jewelry box sat untouched. The delicate ballerina inside was still poised in a perpetual arabesque. He slipped it into his pocket, a surprise for later. "You ready, Harold?" Frank asked, already loading the boxes. "Just a minute," Harold answered, his voice thick. He stood in what was left of the doorway, committing the view to memory, the sloping meadow that led to the pine forest, the distant peak silhouetted against the blue sky. The drive to the Johnsons' house was mostly silent. Harold watched out the passenger window as his mountain receded in the distance. The cap now rested on his lap, his fingers absently tracing the embroidery. "You two get settled," Louise Johnson bustled as soon as they arrived, showing them to a small but comfortable guest room. "I put fresh towels in the bathroom, and dinner is at 6. Alone, Marta began to unpack while Harold sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "It's temporary," she reminded him, hanging dresses in the closet. "Just until we decide about Robert's offer." Harold nodded, but they both knew the platitude for what it was. At 80 years old, starting over wasn't just daunting. It was nearly impossible. That night, after an awkward dinner filled with polite conversation and pitying glances, Harold stepped out onto the Johnsons' back porch. The stars looked different from this angle. The mountain was a dark shadow against the night sky. He thought of his cap, left on the dresser in their temporary room, and all it represented. Youthful strength, purpose, a lifetime of overcoming adversity. Inside, the phone rang. Marta answered, her voice drifting through the screen door. "Yes, Robert? We're fine for now." "No, I don't think so. I know there's a waiting list. Yes, your father is fine. He's just adjusting." Harold tuned out the conversation. his focus fixed on the distant outline of the mountain. Miles away, under a moon that silvered the destruction, a small figure moved carefully through the wreckage of the Green's cabin. The beam from Elijah's flashlight swept methodically over splintered floorboards and collapsed walls. He carried a tape measure, a notebook, and his father's level, pausing every so often to jot down a measurement or test the stability of a remaining joist. Near what had been the front entrance, a patch of blue among the splintered wood caught his eye. Kneeling, he pulled Harold's veteran cap from the debris. He brushed it off, studying the embroidered insignia with reverence. Carefully, he placed it in his backpack, a tangible link to the man whose home he now served with a resolve far beyond his years. 3 days into their stay, Marta had established a routine that gave structure to their displacement. Mornings were spent helping Louise with chores, tasks that allowed Marta to feel useful instead of like a burden. In the afternoons, she sat on the porch making calls to insurance adjusters who offered little hope, and to Robert, whose patience with his parents' reluctance to commit to Arizona was wearing thin. Harold, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. He spent hours in Frank's workshop without building anything, just running his hands over tools so much like the ones he had lost. Sometimes, he would disappear on long walks, returning with muddy boots and a distant expression that worried Marta deeply. The beam from Elijah's flashlight swept methodically across the splintered floorboards and crumbled walls. He carried a tape measure, a notebook, and his father's level, pausing now and then to jot down a measurement or test the stability of what remained. Near what had once been the front door, something caught his eye, a flash of blue amid the wooden debris. Kneeling, he pulled out Harold's veteran cap, overlooked in the chaos of their departure. Elijah dusted it off, studying the embroidered insignia with reverence. He carefully placed it in his backpack, a tangible link to the man whose home he now surveyed with a determination far beyond his years. 3 days into their stay at the Johnsons', Marta had established a routine that gave some structure to their uprooted lives. Mornings were spent helping Louise with chores, tasks that allowed Marta to feel useful, not a burden. In the afternoons, she would sit on the porch, making calls to insurance adjusters who offered little hope, and to Robert, whose patience was wearing thin with his parents' hesitation to commit to Arizona. Harold, meanwhile, grew more and more withdrawn. He'd pass hours in Frank's workshop, building nothing, simply running his hands over tools so similar to the ones he'd lost. Sometimes, he would vanish on long walks, returning with muddy boots and a distant expression that troubled Marta to her core.